Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, February 13th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The Pentagon wants to restart special ops inside Ukraine. So the Pentagon is looking to restart special operations programs that it was conducting inside Ukraine before Russia invaded last year. And this is according to a Washington Post report that came out on Friday. So these programs, they're known as surrogate operations. They involve employing Ukrainian operatives to track Russian military movements and to conduct information warfare. The Ukrainians involved in the programs would be overseen by U.S. Special Operations troops. So the way this program works is that it's basically U.S. military personnel, special operations, directing Ukrainian operatives on what to do. And they were doing this inside Ukraine before the invasion. These operations began in 2018, and so the information warfare aspect of it involved using bloggers to counter so-called Russian disinformation. So this is a very interesting detail here. The Washington Post quoted somebody that said that they had people taking apart, what they call Russian propaganda and telling the what the U.S. says is the true story on blogs. And I think that's really something. Just the fact that the U.S. military is involved in, Ukrainian blog posting and media and narrative control inside Ukraine. That's really something. And then the other program involved U.S. commandos sending Ukrainians on reconnaissance missions in eastern Ukraine, where a civil war had been raging since 2014 that was sparked by a U.S. backed coup. So it sounds like, they didn't get specific, but it sounds like they're doing reconnaissance in the eastern Donbass region. A government official told the Washington Post, a U.S. government official said, quote, "We trained surrogates to go collect signals, intelligence off a Russian radar battery, stuff like that," end quote. So restarting this program would likely involve deploying U.S. troops to Ukraine, although it's possible that they could direct the surrogates from outside the country. The Post report said that there is no known U.S. troop presence in Ukraine besides the personnel based at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, but that's not true. Back in October, The Intercept reported that U.S. Special Operations Forces were inside Ukraine, as well as CIA operatives. Now, that hasn't been really reported elsewhere. What The Intercept reported back in October, unfortunately, it was kind of buried in a story, and no other media really thought it was worth kind of looking into. But there is reports that there's U.S. Special Operations Forces and also those U.S. military personnel based at the embassy. They're also conducting, according to the Pentagon, on-site weapons inspections. That means they're going outside of the embassy, possibly outside of Kiev, to go inspect U.S. weapons. So the Pentagon is trying to convince Congress to reauthorize the resumption of the surrogate programs in Ukraine, and the Pentagon insists that they will be involved in non-combat operations. But of course, there's skepticism that, if they're deploying these surrogates, in this big war, they could very easily end up in combat. So a U.S. official told the Post, quote, "What started as a reconnaissance mission can quickly turn into combat when the surrogates start getting shot at. I think that's a real possibility in Ukraine, and I'm not sure how the department is going to change people in Congress's minds about that," end quote. So fortunately, it sounds like, the Pentagon is going to need congressional approval for this. And it doesn't sound like many people in Congress are convinced. It seems like at least there's some sense that sending U.S. troops inside Ukraine to conduct an operation like this is a huge risk. Because I think if there are special operations forces in Ukraine right now, I don't think that was authorized by Congress. And this, you got to remember what President Biden said earlier in the war. He said sending troops to Ukraine is World War III. And here we have these reports that they're already there, and the Pentagon's considering sending more. And if this program is reauthorized, it would mark another dramatic escalation of U.S. military involvement in the war, and it would make a direct clash with Russia much more likely. Whether or not the U.S. troops are deployed to Ukraine, say they restart this operation and the troops running it are in Poland or Romania or something, Moscow, either way, Moscow is going to look at it as a huge provocation. The U.S. directing, I mean, he could argue that they're directing this entire war right now. I guess they really are, but still, this would still be another increase in U.S. involvement. All right, the next one here. British weapons could be manufactured in Ukraine. So this is according to a report from the Telegraph that said British weapons could start being made in Ukraine under a plan that would significantly boost cooperation between Kiev and NATO and further raise tensions with Moscow. So this report said that UK defense industry executives are discussing the plans with their Ukrainian counterparts and have recently traveled to the country. Their vision is to set up joint ventures to manufacture weapons and military vehicles locally inside Ukraine under license. Arms makers from other European countries are also in talks to begin producing weapons inside Ukraine. A British industry source told the Telegraph that they are trying to get at the front of the queue to beat other countries to the punch. So they're in a race to start making weapons in Ukraine with other companies in Europe, including companies in France and Germany. And this is an example of how these NATO countries have these really long-term plans for Ukraine, which goes just beyond the current military assistance. It goes into the future, into reconstruction, and it goes into this. They want to, really create, a military industrial complex inside Ukraine. And of course, Russia would view such cooperation as a significant step toward Ukrainian NATO membership, although Ukrainian officials believe they're already a de facto member of the alliance, and it's pretty hard to argue against that point. Factories producing NATO weapons inside Ukraine would likely be targeted by the Russian military. Producing weapons inside Ukraine, it could ease the burden on U.S. and other NATO countries' military stockpiles that are being depleted by arming Ukraine. But any arrangement like that, it's going to take years to set up, and who knows where the war is going to be, even in a few months. With looks like Russia's starting this big offensive, and who knows where we're going to be at. And the plan, again, it demonstrates their long-term plans. Back in October, Politico reported that NATO has a 10-year plan to rebuild Ukraine's military and arms industry to make the country more interoperable with the alliance. And this plan is about shifting Ukraine away from the Soviet equipment, which for many cases, when it comes to tanks, although they're getting new tanks, and when it comes to fighter jets and things like that, that's all Soviet equipment that Ukraine is using, that Ukrainian troops are trained on. Again, that's changing. And another aspect of this is that they want Ukraine to be able to make weapons, inside the country. Again, they have big plans for Ukraine. They don't want to, end this thing anytime soon. All right, so the next article here, the U.S. military shoots down another flying object. It's the fourth flying object that they've shot down recently. And things are getting very strange here with this situation. So the U.S. military shot down another flying object on Sunday over Lake Huron in Michigan. And this was announced by Canada's defense minister. This was an operation carried out by the North American Aerospace Defense Command, that is NORAD, and that command is responsible for the defense of U.S. and Canadian airspace. The Canadian defense minister said, quote, "Today, a high-altitude object was detected in U.S. airspace over Lake Huron. NORAD launched Canadian and U.S. aircraft to investigate, and the object was taken down in U.S. airspace by U.S. aircraft," end quote. So again, this was on Sunday. The Pentagon said that a U.S. F-16 fighter jet shot down the object, which was described as octagonal. That's the only description I saw of it. It looked like an octagon. And the Pentagon said that it did not assess the object to be a kinetic military threat to anything on the ground, but said it was a hazard due to its potential surveillance capabilities. Who knows if they know anything about what this object was at all that they decided to shoot down. But this is the third time that the U.S. shot down an unidentified object since they downed that Chinese balloon off the coast of South Carolina. And So it's actually 3 days in a row. On Friday, Biden ordered the Pentagon to shoot down an unidentified object over waters near Alaska, and then the following day, a US fighter jet shot down another object over Canada. 3 days in a row, they shoot 3 objects down. And it's not clear what they are. And excuse me. And remember, with the Chinese balloon, the US claimed it's a surveillance balloon, while China insists it's a weather balloon used for civilian purposes. The Pentagon and the US is now saying China has this big network of spy balloons that are all over the world, but at the same time, China's also has weather balloon, is always known to have weather balloons. So who knows what the situation was with that. But with these other objects, the White House said that these are the ones that they shot down on Friday and Saturday. They haven't really said much about the one on Sunday, but the ones shot down on Friday and Saturday did not look similar to the Chinese balloon. A National Security Council spokesperson told Reuters, quote, "These objects did not closely resemble and were much smaller than the PRC balloon, and we will definitely not characterize them until we can recover the debris, which we are working on," end quote. So while the Pentagon just started shooting down these objects, a report from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, that's the DNI, that was released in January, it said that unidentified flying objects were frequently reported to the U.S. military in recent years. According to the New York Times, the report examines 366 incidents either observed or submitted to the U.S. military since the last report on unexplained phenomenon was released in June 2021. So this was released in January of this year. So it's about a year and a half. There was 366 incidents reported objects flying to the U.S. military, UFOs. And of these incidents, 163 turned out to be balloons. And it's not clear I read the report, I read the New York Times report on the report. It's not clear if they mean big weather balloons or little, birthday party balloons. So who knows? But I think that's pretty interesting. 163 that were worthy enough to be reported to the military or the military observed them themselves. 26 of these were drones, and then 6 were airborne clutter or birds, which means trash or birds. And then the other 171 incidents have yet to be attributed. The panic that has ensued due to the Chinese balloon and the pressure President Biden came under for not shooting it down right away seems to be the trigger for the U.S. military to start shooting down what are frequently spotted UFOs. The panic is also being used by members of Congress to justify a more hawkish posture toward Beijing. So it seems like they saw stuff like this all the time, or it was reported, and now after that whole Chinese balloon incident, and maybe they've saw balloons like that one before. They actually said that there were 3 under Trump, but they didn't detect them until later. Again, the whole thing's very strange. I don't really know what to make of it. I'm not going to pretend like I know what's going on here, but I think it's important to point out that there's been these objects flying around for a while now, and now they're starting to shoot them down, and it seems like they're very quick to do it too. So doesn't that sound dangerous? That there could be a mistake in the future if they keep doing this. But anyway, back to what this is being used to justify, again, a more hawkish position toward China. A growing number of Republicans are arguing that the balloon incident shows military spending cuts should be taken off the table. And the U.S. also used the balloon incident to increase sanctions on China, blacklisting 6 Chinese companies allegedly linked to Chinese surveillance balloons. Amid the panic in the U.S., China said that it spotted a UFO over waters near the northern port city of Qingdao. Local authorities in China said they were ready to shoot it down, but so far there's been no sign that it was shot down. Also, I remember in January, Russia said that it shot down a UFO. So it's not just the U.S. government, reporting and reacting to incidents like this. Again, the whole thing's strange, and 3 days in a row they shoot things down. It's just weird. I don't know what to make of it, but it's important to kind of just look at these stories and ask the obvious questions. Okay, so the next one here, the U.S. and Papua New Guinea hold talks on a military agreement. So the US and Papua New Guinea just wrapped up talks on signing a military agreement as the Biden administration is looking to expand military ties in the Asia Pacific as part of its strategy against China. The State Department said in a statement, quote, the United States and Papua New Guinea held negotiations on February 6th to the 10th in Honolulu, Hawaii, to discuss a defense cooperation agreement that would strengthen security cooperation between our two countries, end quote. The State Department said that the negotiators made substantial progress on the text of an agreement, signaling that a deal could be reached soon. When completed and signed, the State Department said that this deal would enhance security cooperation, further strengthen their relationship, all that stuff, improve the capacity of Papua New Guinea's military. Ahead of the talks, Papua New Guinea's foreign minister said that the deal would focus on boosting their own military and that it would not mean a buildup of U.S. forces in the country. He said, quote, it's not a situation in which we will have warships. Yes, training is definitely one part of it, but not building up the U.S. forces here in Papua New Guinea, end quote. So he said, he's saying that they're going to be training. So it sounds like, U.S. military trainers at least will deploy there under this deal once it's signed. And that could, this could be the start of the beginning of something and it could lead to the U.S. establishing some kind of military base here. So if you're watching the video, I just have a map of the region, Papua New Guinea, just north of Australia, very close to the Solomon Islands, where where China signed a security deal. And it's a focus on, they say, on law enforcement cooperation. China can deploy police, and I believe their warships could stop there now, but Australia was really upset about it. The U.S. was really upset about it, and they're accusing the Solomon Islands of allowing China to build a base there, but they strongly deny that. But this is, I definitely think part of a reaction to that, and just in general, this is the U.S. Reaction to part of the strategy against China. So their foreign minister, also said that it was a reaction to the Solomon Islands agreement. And a few months ago, Papua New Guinea's Prime Minister, James Marape, said that his country could not afford to get caught in the middle of the tensions between the US, China, and Australia. He said, your enemy is not my enemy. Keep your fight to yourselves. But then you see that they are negotiating some kind of deal with the US. And, there's a lot of could be explanations for this, that they're under pressure from Australia to align with the US and Australia against China is likely the case. But their talks are the latest in a series of steps that the U.S. has taken to increase its military and diplomatic presence in the region. And that was outlined by the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy that was released last year. Increase military and diplomatic presence in this region because of China, to build up around China, to encircle China. And just in recent weeks, basically over the past month, the U.S. signed a deal to expand its military presence in the Philippines, opened a new base in Guam, announced new military cooperation with Japan, opened an embassy in the Solomon Islands, and worked on agreements with the Federated States of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau. And those are the three countries in Oceania that the U.S. has these deals with that, it's basically the U.S. gives them some aid. Their people can get citizenship pretty easily, and the U.S. military has access to these islands. And the big thing is that they can deny access of another foreign military to these areas, and it's a pretty big stretch of ocean. So the U.S. definitely has an interest in keeping that. And so again, this is all part of this buildup, and that's a lot of stuff that they've been up to. They're really accelerating this military buildup against China. All right, the next one here, the U.S. conducts aircraft carrier drills in the South China Sea amid balloon tensions. So the U.S. Navy and the Marine Corps are conducting drills in the South China Sea. The U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet said in a statement that the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz and its strike group conducted the drills on February 11th with the 13th Marine Expeditionary Unit. So it's a decent amount of U.S. warships and planes involved in these drills. And the U.S. has stepped up its activity in the South China Sea in recent years, informally rejected most of Beijing's claims to the waters. So there's a big territorial dispute here. China claims pretty decent sized area, but there's also overlapping claims between, Brunei and the Philippines. They have all their own overlapping claims, and Vietnam claims a pretty huge stretch of the South China Sea. Um, but the U.S. has, rejected most of China's claims, and part of that is that they sail warships into the region. They really started doing that under Obama near Chinese controlled islands. And again, the deal with the Philippines, that's all about increasing their military presence in this region. Um, so again, tensions between the U.S. and China are high, and these exercises came after China declined a call from Lloyd Austin after the U.S. shot down that balloon. Um, all right, so the next one here, the U.S. eases some sanctions on Syria for 180 days. So some good news here. The U.S. has issued a 180-day exemption for its sanctions on Syria that applies to all transactions related to earthquake relief efforts. The Treasury Department announced this last Thursday night. And it came after this earthquake. I mean, the death toll is huge now. As of Sunday, over 33,000 people have been killed, mostly in Turkey, about 29,000 in Turkey. And in Syria, 4,500 people have died so far. And the death toll keeps going up. I mean, it's just a total disaster. And after the earthquake, it was clear that U.S. sanctions were going to inhibit the relief effort, even though, of course, the U.S. denied it. But I think it showed that, they knew they were lying because they issued this exemption. And there was growing pressure for them to do so. So UN experts welcomed the exemption, but they say more needs to be done. Sanctions need to be lifted altogether. And again, this is just an exemption. There's still going to be restrictions in place. So Elena Duhan, she's a UN special rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures, which are sanctions are unilateral coercive measures. She wrote on Twitter, quote, "While welcoming steps taken to suspend some sanctions on Syria, I call all sanctioning states to lift sanctions, to open all ways to deliver humanitarian aid, and to ensure that no donor, bank, or other actor is punished for humanitarian help to Syrians to avoid overcompliance," end quote. So Duhan and several other UN experts, they released a joint statement that also called for the lifting of all sanctions. They said they welcome the exemption, but that it might not be enough to offset the harm that sanctions cause. They say you still have to worry about business over compliance, even though there's this exemption. Some companies just don't want to deal with it. They don't want to have to check with the U.S. or make sure that they're not running afoul of sanctions. The statement said that they were concerned that relief efforts were facing such severe restrictions, after a natural disaster. And they said that there are reports that Syrians in other countries cannot send money to their families. They are unable to provide financial support through remittances or other means of funding. So say you're Syrian and you live in another country and you have family in northwest Syria that's devastated by this. You want to help them out. You can't send them money because of these sanctions. Just shows how cruel that they are. And even if the exemption successfully allows more relief efforts, U.S. sanctions on Syria, they're specifically designed to prevent the country's reconstruction. It's going to hamper rebuilding after the earthquake. That's what they're designed to do. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, said in 2021 that it is U.S. policy to oppose the reconstruction of Syria, the reconstruction after the war, but that's going to apply to rebuilding after an earthquake. So the earthquake caused damage and killed people in both government-controlled territories in Syria and other areas in the northwest that are mostly controlled by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which is an Al-Qaeda-linked group. Basically, they are, Al-Qaeda. They came from the Al-Nusra Front. They're an offshoot of that, which was Al-Qaeda in Syria. And then there are other groups like Haras al-Din, which is other Al-Qaeda members, and the U.S. Launches drone strikes against them from time to time in Idlib. But then HTS is kind of tacitly backed by Turkey and tacitly backed by the U.S. because they keep this territory out of hands of the Syrian government and Russia. So the U.S. likes this situation that this Al-Qaeda group controls Idlib. And they're blocking aid. So the Syrian media reported on Friday that Damascus approved aid deliveries into opposition-controlled areas, But a UN spokesperson said on Sunday that earthquake aid into Idlib from government controlled areas was being held up by HTS. The spokesperson said that there were improvement issues with HTS. And a source for the Al Qaeda linked group told Reuters that they didn't want to accept the aid out of concerns that it would make Assad look good, is basically what this source said. He said, quote, "We won't allow the regime to take advantage of the situation to show that they are helping," end quote. So deprive the people of aid that live in that area because you don't want Assad to look good. I mean, that's sick stuff. But somebody in the comments I saw said, if you didn't read the article and you heard that quote, would you think it was Al Qaeda or the State Department? It does sound like something the State Department would say. But again, good news. It could be better, but hopefully, there's more pressure that the U.S. I would be surprised if they lift sanctions altogether, but there is a lot of pressure on them to do so, or ease them more, or I don't know, make the exemption longer. The next one here is from Will Porter over at the Libertarian Institute. The U.S. carries out an ICBM test. So the U.S. Air Force has test launched a Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile, the primary land-based strategic weapon in America's nuclear arsenal. The Pentagon hailed the trial as a success, declaring that the display of military might shows Washington is willing to defend peace across the globe. The Air Force's Global Strike Command announced the weapons test on Friday, noting it was conducted at the Vandenberg Space Force Base in California the day prior. The unarmed missile was equipped with a test re-entry vehicle for the launch, traveling some 4,200 miles to an atoll in the Marshall Islands. So they're still using the Marshall Islands to test weapons. Will says that the trial on Thursday was the Pentagon's first ICBM test since last August, when a Minuteman III was fired from the same base in California. And that launch was delayed for several weeks, reportedly due to concerns among U.S. officials that it could escalate tensions with China, because it was right after Pelosi went to Taiwan and China launched its largest ever military exercises. And before that, the U.S. canceled another ICBM test last April. And in that case, that was over concerns of raising tensions with Russia. But now, even though tensions are so high with Russia and China, they launched this ICBM test. Okay. So the last one here, this is from Responsible Statecraft. And it says, Congress is finally poised to repeal the Iraq War Authorization. Is Afghanistan next? So a bipartisan group of lawmakers in the House and the Senate introduced a bill on Thursday that would repeal the congressional authorizations for the use of force for the 1991 and 2003 Iraq wars. So this is good. The unfortunate thing is that these AUMFs, as they are called, aren't used anymore to justify military action. The last time, although the Trump administration, it's good to get them off the books, because the Trump administration actually cited the 2003 Iraq AUMF as justification for killing Soleimani, the Iranian general. But the big one is the one that was passed in 2001 for the Afghanistan war that really started the war on terror as we know it in this century. And that's still on the books and still used to justify operations against ISIS. And if that gets repealed, that could be really good. But the problem is that the Biden administration has used the Constitution to justify airstrikes. They'll just use whatever they want. I still think, this reform is good and they should repeal all this stuff. But after Biden launched airstrikes in Syria, I think it was back in 2021, they cited Article 2 of the Constitution because they claimed it was in defense of U.S. military personnel, which is just nonsense. So again, it's good. And this this is from Connor Eccles, gets into, if that could be next. The 2001 could be next, hopefully. But that's it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Ted Snyder, when the U.S. assumed joint ownership of the war in Ukraine. We have one from Jonathan Cook, Russia-Ukraine War 2.0, first tanks, then F-16s. Where does this end? That is a good question. One from Branko March Teach over at Jacobin. The grinding war in Ukraine could have ended a long time ago. One from Matthew Petty. Why liberal hawks rule the roast. That's over at The Critic. And our spotlight is from Bradley Devlin at the American Conservative, counting the dead in Ukraine. Also, if you're watching the video, you'll see we have an ad on the page for the Rage Against the War Machine anti-war rally that will be held this Sunday, February 19th at 12:30 at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. So get there if you can. It's going to be a big event. There's a lot of great speakers. We're going to be represented by Scott Horton. So definitely go if you can. Go check out the website for the speaker list. That's it for me for today. Go to antiwar.com/donate if you want to support us. You could also help support us by sharing the show around, like and subscribe on YouTube, all that stuff. That's it for me for today. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Thanks for listening.